So that's what I did on Saturday, along with about 2,000 other people in Trafalgar Square. And the aim was obviously to raise awareness of homelessness. You know, anybody who lives in central London is very aware of it, as you can see every day on the streets. And also to raise some money for homeless charities. But incredibly, despite me thinking, well, that's quite a good thing to do, some people think that that's a terrible thing to do, that we shouldn't be raising money for any charity and it should all be done by the state. Well, it's a point of view. And I don't deny that a lot of government policies have contributed to the homelessness problem. And I think one of the big things, whoever wins the election, is to actually tackle that.
Let's just talk about the statistics, though. How much did you raise? How much did the event raise? And
the event took place in, I think, 50 different countries and has raised over $10 million. I've raised £31,000. So, and thank you for your donation.
Well, congratulations on that. Do you think the state should be doing this, so we shouldn't need charity to deal with homelessness?
Well, no, look, I think it's amazing when people are stepping up and, you know, putting yourself in that position to raise money. I think is a really laudable thing, and I don't see why anyone wouldn't think about it those terms. But you know, the big issue is homelessness has increased over the last 10 years. We've gone from about 1,700 people living on our streets to about 4,700. People dying on our streets has gone up by about 50%. And, you know, there is a failure of policy in that. You know, so whether it's the failure to tackle the housing crisis, whether it's the failure to deal with no rent, no fault evictions, or it's the cut to housing benefits, they've all had a detrimental impact on homelessness. And I think you're completely right. It is an absolute travesty that in, you know, the fifth richest country, we have people living and dying on our streets. And it doesn't matter who wins the next election.
I mean, Ian points out this is an international issue. I mean, I understand San Francisco at the moment is absolutely overrun with...
I mean, look, I take the point about the fifth largest economy, the fifth richest country, but the first richest country is also experiencing it. But, I mean, Louise Casey, when she was homeless inside, I won't say it was eradicated under the Blair government, but it was certainly... It was significantly reduced. And I think we've got to learn the lessons from that. We've got to learn the lessons from how other countries do it.
How was it, actually? I mean, in my younger days, I ended up sleeping rough through bad planning a few times. I remember it being very cold.
Well, it wasn't that cold, actually, on Saturday night, but it was very wet. I didn't think it was going to rain.
You all had these sort of red bags over you.
Yeah, it looked a bit like the aftermath of a terror attack with all these people in these orange sort of body bags. I mean, it was a bit strange in that regard. But it was, I mean, 3 hours of rain is not pleasant for anybody. But of course, and as you can probably tell, I've had quite a bit of a cold over the last few days. And I was thinking, well, should I really do this, given that I've got to spend 8 hours presenting LBC's election night coverage on Thursday? Do I really want to risk getting ill? But I thought, well, homeless people don't have that choice. If they're ill, they still have to sleep rough. So it probably wasn't the wisest decision I made, but I think it was important to do.
Now, turning to the comment pieces we picked out, I was struck that John Harris and Claire Foges, one on the left, one on the right, seem to be on the same page as far as what the Conservatives are offering in this election.
Yeah, I mean, and I think, you know, Claire's piece is a really, really good one. And she sort of accuses the Tories of having disdain for voters, partly because of the kind of unwillingness to stand up to scrutiny and, you know, Boris Johnson's, you know, unwillingness to do the Andrew Neil interview. But for me, the kind of really powerful point she makes is the manifesto is incredibly empty. It's incredibly thin. She calls it disdainful, particularly against the backdrop of, you know, the squeeze in living standards, the climate emergency, the ageing society. And a manifesto is supposed to be a blueprint for what you're trying to do for the country and how you're trying to transform and change the country. And, you know, for me, it's either an election strategy, so you get rid of the barnacles, you say absolutely nothing, you coast to number 10, which shows disdain, quite frankly, for voters, or they have no answers, they have no ideas. And if they do win, you know, and there's still a big if of that, but if they do win and they literally have no solutions to the big problems that we face going into the next 5 years, I find that terrifying.
I mean, do you see it that way, Ian? You've been talking to... Is it a thin manifesto?
It's a very thin manifesto. I'm not sure I'd go so far as to say it shows complete disdain, but, I mean, there's not a lot to talk about in it. I mean, the Labour Party manifesto is perhaps overfull of promises, and I think that's led people to think, well, could they really deliver on even half of this in a 5-year government? It's a safety-first manifesto. Boris Johnson is the Stanley Baldwin of our days in some ways, and they don't want to frighten the electoral horses. Well, it's a strategy. Whether it works, we'll see on Thursday.
Do you think it is? I mean, both Foges and John Harris seem to be saying, you know, get Brexit done, we leave formally at the end of January if Boris Johnson wins this election, but then it's going to bite him. I mean, not having ideas. Do you think that's right?
It could well do. The thing with the Get Brexit Done thing is we all get rather annoyed at the constant repetition of it. It's the strong and stable of this campaign. But Jackie Smith, my colleague, she was canvassing in Workington on Saturday, and she said that former Labour voters were just repeating this back to her on the doorstep. It has cut through with the very people that the Conservatives are targeting in this election. They understand it. They're angry that it hasn't been done. And lifelong Labour voters seem to be, if the anecdotal evidence is to be believed, pouring over to the Conservatives in these northern Labour marginal seats.
And this is where I think John Harris's piece is interesting. So it's a great slogan. It does cut through. It's very clear, you know, by contrast, Labour's sort of central line is quite kind of complex in all of this. But, you know, the big issue for them is, say you do get a whole load of lifelong Labour voters voting for Conservatives. What then? What happens on the 1st of February when we're still talking about Brexit? And yes, we may have left, but we haven't got it done because Brexit is a process that's going to take at least another 5 years, if not 10 years. But more importantly, you know, Brexit was supposed to be about change. And just getting Brexit done, just with the leaving in terms of the withdrawal agreement, is not going to unleash the change that the country wants. And what worries me is behind that manifesto, there was nothing about what they're going to do for the country.
That's what interests me.
And that's what's going to bite him in the...
It's quite clear, you know, endless analysis, everyone says it, we're not left-right anymore, we're leave, remain and all that. But once Brexit is done, is that going to be a change permanently, or are people just going to revert to the old left-right?
Then the challenge really is there. If the Conservatives win a majority at the election, they will then have 5 years. If at the end of that 5 years, nothing has changed, to coin a phrase from Theresa May, then Labour may well think that this was quite a good election to lose this time, because they will be in prime position then. They will have a new leader, despite what the
And that would be asking for
say.
a fifth Tory election victory, which has never been done. Yeah.
Exactly, and politics is always cyclical. You can go 3 or maybe 4, as Thatcher and Major did, but you don't go after that. So whoever becomes the next leader after Corbyn, assuming the Conservatives win this time, they stand an extremely good chance of being Prime Minister and winning that election. If the Conservatives cannot prove by the end of those 5 years that things have materially changed in all sorts of ways, we're agreeing far too much.
I know this, but I think that is a real risk for the Conservatives, because if they do win and they go in without a plan, without perspectives of what they do once we've left the European Union, against the backdrop of a decade of living standard squeeze, we know a recession's coming in the next year and a half. They will preside over that.
Do we?
Well, all the international evidence suggests it's not just a UK problem. I think globally we're on the verge of a slowdown.
I mean, technically, talk about cycles, we're overdue.
Yeah, well, exactly.
True, yeah.
And our public services are in an absolute state. So if they preside over that and they don't get a grip and they don't have a plan, at the end of that 5 years, they will be punished. You could be talking about a Conservative government out of power for a
OK, thank you very much. We've got this week's election to get out of the way before we look 5 years ahead. Thank you.